The World Bank will release its biannual report, Africa's Pulse, the economic impact of COVID-19 in Africa. This will be the World Bank's first report on the economic impact of COVID-19 on the African region. In pre-briefing notes, the World Bank indicates that it expects economies in Sub-Saharan Africa to contract by as much as 5.1%. This follows an average growth of 2.4% in 2019 in the region. The bank says due to deteriorating fiscal positions and increased public debt among some countries, governments have very little wiggle room to deploy fiscal policy to address the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic. Bodies like the World Bank have already requested developed nations to assist regions like Sub-Saharan Africa with debt relief, among other measures. Well, to get more elaboration on their expectations, let's cross live there.
These African countries have budgeted oil at around $55 for 2020. And as we speak, the price of oil is hovering between $20 and $25 per barrel. So just think about it. Picture this. It's like your salary was cut by 60%, yet you have to still pay your bills at the end of the month. You still have to pay your electricity bill, your telephone bill, and provide food for your family while your salary has been cut by more than 60%. That's what governments are struggling with in Africa, especially governments who depend on oil. So that's why it's so important, Maura.
So you mentioned Angola there, and I want to come back to that as well. What's happening in these sort of very large economies in Africa? I'm thinking about South Africa, Nigeria, Angola, that make up somewhere around 60% of the region's GDP.
Right. Angola, Nigeria, and South Africa, our three largest economies, will be hardest hit by this crisis. And what we are projecting is that growth could actually decline even below the average we have shared earlier, and growth could actually decline to -6 to -7% for these countries. And the reason is that even entering the crisis, the economy wasn't very, very dynamic already. South Africa was already in recession. Angola was already facing difficulties with keeping investment high. And in Nigeria, the recovery was still very, very timid. So the shock of COVID is compounding already existing difficulties, and that is dragging down growth in these countries and therefore reducing significantly average growth across Africa.
Thanks. And what about some of the other countries that we think about when we think about these sort of world leaders in fastest growing economies, things like that? I'm thinking of Ghana, Ethiopia, Cote d'Ivoire, Senegal, these other countries. What's happening in that group?
Well, in that group, Maura, what is clear is that all groups in Africa will be affected. So yes, Sub-Saharan Africa as a continent is extremely heterogeneous. And in the past, we have seen a group of fast-growing countries, as you mentioned, Ethiopia, Rwanda, Senegal, Cote d'Ivoire, Ghana, pulling the average up when the largest economies were not doing well. The bad news here is that COVID will affect all economies. And although growth will remain marginally positive in those fast-growing economies in Africa, it's not going to be high enough to bring the average up. That's what's happening.
Got it. So I have a question here from Twitter from a gentleman called Otto, who asks, how well prepared is the typical African household for the coming loss of jobs and income in light of already high employment rates across Africa? What's your take on that?
Well, Maura, I think it would be fair to say nobody on planet Earth was prepared for this crisis, for a crisis of this magnitude. No household was prepared to face this, not in China, not in the USA, not in Africa. So we are all, struggling. Most governments are struggling, and most households and people are just struggling to adapt to a flow of information that is just moving so fast. that is really difficult to manage. So we have to be absolutely modest enough to admit that we are working with many unknowns and the situation is so dynamic. But governments in Africa are already taking a lot of measures in the right directions. But those measures are clearly important to protect individuals, especially those in the informal sector. Making sure economies do not collapse by helping the private sector and firms, SMEs, keep some of those jobs running. Putting in place some social protection measures. It is important to enforce containment, but it's also important in parallel to be providing for basic necessities if populations that live on a daily basis from the interaction with masses are forced to stay home. I think it's important to think of all those to help African people cope with this crisis.
That makes a lot of sense. You started to get into a little bit about what governments can do. I think we've set out the scene very well. Thank you for that. But I think a lot of people are asking, what can be done about this? We've now seen this wave kind of come across the world, and different countries have done different things. And what is the World Bank's advice to countries across Africa?
Well, Maura, I think the World Bank advice is very, very clear. We are working with countries in Africa to save lives while protecting livelihoods. What we mean is that it is important to focus on the emergency health situation, but we should, in parallel, creating the right environment for activity not to collapse. We need to avoid sudden stops in economic activity. We need to be helping households with some cash transfers in countries that do have those. We need to be helping households with some food distribution for countries that can afford to do so, and other in-kind transfers. We need to be, working with government needs to be working with the private sector to prevent massive layoffs, and that could include some wage subsidies, as we've seen in some other countries. And other countries are also, and that's the right thing to do, trying to limit the weight of this crisis on revenues by delaying taxes and delaying basic service fees, electricity and mobile money transactions. All these measures are being taken, and we believe that's going to be useful to actually allow activities to continue while we take care of the health crisis.
So should African countries be doing the same as what they're seeing happening in other countries? I'm thinking China, United States, countries across Europe, Italy, France. Should Africa be sort of taking that model and applying it exactly on Africa? And I know there's, we're talking about 48 different countries, 48 kinds of economies. So there's no one size fits all solution. But what can African countries learn from? And also what maybe should they be doing differently?
Well, that's a very, very interesting question, Maura, because in this crisis, we are all drinking from the fire hose, and there's not that much time to think and and strategize. So there are policy responses that Africa can clearly copy from the rest of the world, but African policy response should also be differentiated to reflect the structure of our economies and the peculiar constraints that our government face. So in the first category of policies that can be adopted from elsewhere, I think they need to really create command control teams that are led by respected scientists and technical people who would give the right kind of information and trusted information to the public, a command and control team that coordinates, the response within government, from the top executive to health authorities, economics and finance authorities. That is something a lot of countries are doing around the world, and African countries need to do the same. But they also need to differentiate their policy response. Implementing strict containment rules for populations that have to live on a daily basis from hand to mouth without actually implementing some fiscal stimulus to help them survive may not work that well. So it is important to think of the structure of those economies. It is also important, given the limited resources we have, to think of really protecting our medical personnel in priority and make sure that they have all the protective gear they have to take care of the rest. It is also important to scale up testing, if we can, to very quickly isolate those who are sick. And we should also, quite importantly, learn from the lessons of past crises like Ebola. And one of the lessons that really worked well was the community-level response, right? Problem solving at the community level by community leaders that are credible really made a big difference in countries affected by Ebola.
That makes a lot of sense. I think that idea of trust and credibility and where our information is coming from is so important, and we're seeing that everywhere. So is this something that every country should try to tackle by itself? Is this an individual country by country response, or is there a role for some regional institutions, for example, or a cross-country approach? And are you seeing countries already working together, or sort of regional approaches that are on the front lines of fighting this?
Maura, I think this is a global crisis, and the most effective response must be global. At the African level, individual countries' responses are important, but they may not be enough. It is important to think of a response, a collective response, and the African Union and the CDC are already embarking on that approach. It may be useful, for example, to think of, collective action to import gloves or tests, or to avail even food, because some countries are now facing difficulties importing the basic necessities. A response at the African Union level may be actually more efficient than individual countries. And in fact, in our modeling and in our results, in our report, we find that if African countries were to collaborate, keep trade flowing between them, and really have a coordinated response, the impact on household and individual welfare will be less damaging. So there will be there is a need, Maura, for African countries to think of this as a regional response, and this could actually be an opportunity to strengthen our regional value chains and start really taking advantage of the African free trade area to produce some of the manufacturing goods that are so needed by African economies, and that cannot be imported at this point in time, given the global shortage.
Thanks. I want to pick up on something you mentioned earlier about food security, or really a lack thereof. And you mentioned this just in your last answer, but also earlier. I know there's a lot of concern. We've gotten some questions in on social media about this as well. This really puts people at risk, a lot of families, a lot of individuals at risk of starvation before they're at risk of catching coronavirus. So how can countries avoid food insecurity? What is being done, and what would your advice be to really make sure that people are fed and survive?
Yeah, Mora, there are two things that are coming out of our studies. One is that imports are going significantly down because of all the global crisis and the trade and movement restrictions from COVID-19. So African countries that do depend on imports, including for food, are at risk of shortages, right? And you know, we also found in our studies that the food bill, the import food bill for Africa is close to $40 billion per year. So a significant decline will put people at risk. The second thing that we find is that because of the containment measures, agricultural production is likely to decline. So it is important to keep food value chains open within countries, but also across borders. We can close borders for, you know, limit populations from moving, but trade needs to remain open.
Gotcha. Another question that's come up quite a bit, we've had several questions on Facebook, on Twitter on this, and I know this is a big issue for the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund at the moment. We're talking a lot about this. The question of debt. There are worries that the debt burden on African countries is harder for them to respond as quickly as they'd like to, and also concerns that more lending to meet the needs of the people and to meet the needs of this crisis is going to lead to more debt on the road. This has been an issue on many people's minds. So what's your take on that, Albert?
Well, Maura, what our study is uncovering is that Sub-Saharan African government do not have much wiggle room in deploying the much needed fiscal policy to address the COVID-19. Our countries do not have those resources, especially given the debt situation, a situation where a number of African countries are spending more than 70% of revenues just to pay salaries and service their debt, pay back your loans. If those countries happen to be oil or mineral exporter, the situation is going to even be worse. So there is no fiscal space, and Africa cannot really fight COVID without global assistance. And that global assistance could come in the form of a standstill on debt service. This is what the World Bank and IMF have been advocating, and African governments as well. It is important for the world and for creditors, African creditors, those who actually have been lending money to Africa, to enact a pause on debt service, which is repayment. And if that was to happen, it could be all the way to $44 billion in 2020. Just imagine what that would do in terms of fighting COVID if African countries could avail those 44 billions instead of using it to pay to reimburse their loans.
That's a big question, and I think we'll be hearing more about that. I hope people will read Africa's Pulse and have a look through about that, because it's a huge question. It's one of the most popular questions I think that we're getting in here. Another question that's coming on Facebook from Wame is asking what measures can be put in place to recover the informal economy, and what kind of financial security can be implemented for small businesses to protect their employees.
Maura, I've mentioned earlier the need to ensure that as we contain, we ask people to remain confined, that we implement social protection measures, and that governments avail basic necessities for these populations. That's true for households, but that's also true for workers in the informal sector. right? You know, if you are a cab driver, or if you are a service worker in a hotel that has closed, or in different activities in our cities, it's going to be difficult to survive unless there is a clear package to help. And the stimulus packages, a number of African countries have been already implementing those fiscal stimulus packages. They could certainly help with some cash transfers. Countries that have already developed the infrastructure for mobile money can leverage it, but also leverage more generally that digital infrastructure to improve efficiency of the public sector, but also efficiency of firms. It's important that we start really using technology, or ramping up our use of technology for productive use. It is important that government certainly step in and help and work with the private sector and private sector associations to find those measures to probably subsidize wages to avoid massive layoff.
Thanks for that. One great question we just got from Twitter, and we're just about to wrap up here, but a good question to think forward. Is there a silver lining to this crisis? Can we take anything from this? Are there lessons that can be learned that can be applied in the future? Do you see any silver linings, or are we still right in the middle of it?
Well, we're still right in the midst of it, and especially for Africa, we haven't actually reached the tip, of this crisis. But I think it's important, even as we're in the middle of the crisis, to really start thinking ahead and start building elements of future resilience in our policy design. Because after all, we need to all agree that this is a very serious crisis, but this is not the end of the world.
Thank you so much for that, Albert Zufak. We're going to leave it there. Thank you very much, Albert Zufak, Chief Economist for the Africa region at the World Bank. And thank you to everyone who's tuned in this morning or this afternoon, wherever you may be. If you want to learn a bit more about what the World Bank's response is to the COVID-19 crisis, you can feel free to visit worldbank.org/coronavirus. And if you want to learn more about what we're doing specifically in the Africa region and for African countries, please go to our website at worldbank.org/Africa. There you can read Africa's Pulse, which is hot off the presses. It's just come out today. It's a great read. I would highly recommend it to everyone. And please go ahead and follow us on Twitter as well at World Bank Africa. Thank you, everyone, again. Thank you, Albert.
Thank you so much, Maura, and thank you, listeners.
Thank you so much. Until next time, stay safe and take care.
Thank you. Bye-bye.